Donald Trump has made repeated claims since the election about his ability and record on pressuring US companies to keep jobs here in the US, to not allow them to move those jobs abroad. And in a couple of high-profile cases, he's gotten an incredible amount of credit given to him for these victories of his. And so I thought, why don't we go back, why don't we update on a couple of those cases and see if he deserves the credit he got. So first of all, you've probably heard of Carrier, because of how good their air conditions are. No, just because the debate about the jobs went on for months. And so we've got a little montage of some of Trump's statements about Carrier pressuring them to keep jobs here.
If I were in office right now, Carrier would not be leaving Indiana, that I can tell you.
We're saving the jobs at the Carrier plant from going to Mexico, 1,100 jobs.
Within 24 hours, I'll get a call, the head of Carrier, and he'll say, Mr. President, we've decided to stay in the United States. All right, that's what's gonna happen, 100%.
These companies aren't gonna be leaving anymore. They're not gonna be taking people's hearts out. They're not going to be announcing, like they did at Carrier, that they're closing up and they're moving to Mexico. Over 1,100 jobs. And by the way, that number is going to go up very substantially.
So big talk there. They're not going to move the jobs they've said they're going to. In fact, there's going to be even more jobs soon. And that was in advance of him negotiating with them, which he did. He ended up giving them, despite the fact that he attacked people who use incentives to keep jobs in the US, decided to give them $7 million in tax breaks to not move those jobs overseas. Additionally, got them to say that they would invest $16 million into that plant, which it turned out a month later, they decided to invest in automation instead.
Yeah, they talked about upgrading the plant. They upgraded it by essentially eliminating a bunch of jobs, making it such that we wouldn't need workers.
Exactly, but okay, fine. It looks like generally he succeeded then. In fact, he put out a tweet saying, big day on Thursday for Indiana and the great workers of that wonderful state. We will keep our companies and jobs in the US, thanks Carrier. And that was met with so much praise in the media and amongst his supporters for keeping those jobs. Look, he's keeping his promises. Except not so much. News broke this week, Carrier is laying off more than 600 employees from its Indianapolis plant next month, the same plant Trump vowed to keep on American soil. Those jobs will in fact go to Mexico. So of course, look, the greatest tragedy is for those 600 plus families who are going to be affected by this. But the country as a whole has been swindled. This was the example of his negotiating ability. And look, I know everybody wants to see the jobs kept, and so there's this desire. We're primed to want to give him credit for doing this. And so a lot of people were very excited. In fact, I don't think anybody predicted that it wouldn't work out the way Trump said, except for this guy. The company originally put more than 2,000 jobs at risk, 1,400 at an Indianapolis plant and 700 at a Huntington plant owned by Carrier's parent company, United Technologies. Fewer than 1,000 will remain even after the deal. So already less than 50% of those who are going to go are supposedly going to stay. That is best case scenario. Now, I don't know that we will see what ends up happening, that it will be reported in the media or that we'll even notice. I guarantee far fewer will actually end up staying here. It's all well and good on day one of some supposed deal to say almost 1,000 jobs were saved. We've covered a lot of companies and we know the sort of shenanigans they get up to. I guarantee far fewer jobs will actually be saved. That guy is normally a moron, but he was right in this particular case.
Unreal, and by the way,
sadly, because those jobs, think of the families.
Yeah.
So excited when the jobs are gonna stay.
No, I mean, and they wrap themselves around that dream and that promise, and you could see, glad we showed all the clips of Trump, because when he speaks in that populist way, you can see that hungry Americans, that is saying, hungry Americans in the sense that they want economic development, they want economic dynamics that they're not experiencing right now. They feel, wow, this is finally the guy. This is our champion. That's why that Carrier message that he stumped all through the campaign was so powerful. But then, as was pointed out by Johnny I, by the way, that was a clip from November, and already you can see those months have taken such a toll on John. He looks so much older.
You can't see my mental health, but it's not good.
But we said at the time, I mean, you were so smart to actually predict that it was essentially bankrupt of any legitimacy. But we said at the time that we were essentially bribing corporations to stay in this country. That's if they actually had stayed here. As it turns out now, they are moving a bunch of jobs to Mexico. But what that also did was sort of set up a precedent, which is, hey, Mr. President, we're going to move unless you could help me out with some taxpayer dollars to keep us in this country. So even on its face, on the merits, were it actually going to happen, which it didn't, it was still a bad idea.
Yeah, a guy who's supposed to know how to negotiate and how business works. I mean, I don't know the first thing about business, but as soon as he made this deal, it's like, if I had a company, I would threaten to go to Mexico. That's obviously what you should do. But look, maybe we're being unfair, focusing just on Carrier, maybe, unforeseen circumstances, all of that. So there were other companies that he successfully pressured to keep their jobs here. At one point, there was concerns about Boeing cutting a bunch of jobs. So back in the day, Donald Trump tweeted this, going to Charleston, South Carolina in order to spend time with Boeing and talk jobs. Looking forward to it. And so he goes and he gives this big speech from one of the Boeing plants. Here's a quote from that speech. "Jobs is one of the primary reasons I'm standing here today as your president, and I will never, ever disappoint you." He also said there would be a very substantial price to pay for companies who fire their employees and move their facilities overseas. Unfortunately, news broke this week. Boeing confirmed to CNN that it's laying off roughly 200 employees from that same plant that he gave that speech at. So I guess we will find out what those very substantial prices to pay will be.
And again, this speaks to the bankruptcy, and I use that word deliberately, of Donald Trump's message. There is nothing to it. It is a bunch of promises, and he makes them to people who are desperate to believe in a promise, and then he doesn't deliver on anything. He's not a good businessman. See the reference bankruptcy. The guy has had, more bankruptcies, I'm sure, than a lot of people have had overdraws on their checking account. I mean, this guy is a horrible businessman, but what he does so effectively is he messages. And in those stump speeches, he makes those promises and you want to believe them. Everyone wants to believe them, and they're carried by mainstream media, and we parse them here on the Turks as best we can, but the truth is a lot of faith was put in just these messages, which are, as I say, completely bankrupt of any legitimacy.
Yeah, you're right. So I watched his speech, about one of the speeches about Carrier, and it wasn't included in that montage we showed you, but he said at one point, as a businessman for years, I take. Now I'm gonna take for you, which sounds great. It's a great line, but he's taking from you. And look at the Senate healthcare bill, which we're gonna break down a little bit later on some more. He's not taking for you. He's giving to the companies, and then the companies will take your jobs away. Anyway.
And by the way, just to say, that is exactly right. I'm glad you made that point, because you heard before the election from those who wanted to believe in Donald Trump, and for those, some of whom were not in such bad economic straits, hey, it's about time we get a businessman in there who can really lean in for America and negotiate good deals for America. Well, they were essentially just regurgitating what he was saying on the stump. I'm gonna make great deals for America. But the truth is, he's not a great deal maker, and we've seen that in business, and now we're seeing it played out here. He's a total counterfeit, and he's an incompetent to boot, but we're seeing now prima facie evidence of that in the case of Boeing, Carrier, and as John says, so on.
Yeah, and let's break down one more area, because we had an interesting contrast over the past decade plus in how the two different sides dealt with the automobile manufacturers. And so back in the Great Recession, there were a couple of car companies which are doing incredibly poorly. They had been for a number of years, but things looked like they were gonna go really bad, and there might be some bankruptcies. Some of the classic American car manufacturers might go under. And under Barack Obama, we decided to bail them out, do this massive investment that they eventually paid back. And for some reason at the time, a lot of Republicans attacked him for saving those classic US jobs. Even after it was paid back, they still said it was a bad idea. This was an issue that came up during the last campaign. So they didn't like that. And so then when it looked like Ford, under Trump was gonna move a bunch of jobs overseas, Trump once again leapt in there, used his superior negotiating skills. This is to commemorate it. He tweeted, "Big announcement by Ford today. Major investment to be made in 3 Michigan plants, car companies coming back to the US. Jobs, jobs, jobs. Shots, shots, shots." So look, he was successful. He once again pressured this big company to keep their jobs. Unfortunately, the joke is on him and the joke is on us, because Ford announced Tuesday it's moving production of its Focus model to China, just months after Trump pressured the company to cancel its plans to move that model to Mexico. So, I mean, I guess it worked. They didn't move to Mexico.
I mean, and look, they're moving for the same reason that Donald Trump makes his ties and makes his products overseas, because the price of labor is so much cheaper. You just can't compete with that overseas labor market. And so, yes, you're seeing Ford, Carrier, and the rest, Boeing. And again, they're leading a parade of companies that have already gone overseas and will continue to go overseas. It's just the labor market there.
Yeah, it's incredibly rough, and it's possibly outside, of the immediate effect of any president to turn that around. There's a lot of history there. But there theoretically are other moves that you could make. You could push for trade deals that increase the negotiating ability and the wages of workers overseas. Try to improve their standard of living, making the comparative advantage of moving overseas less significant. There's a lot of stuff that you can do. And Trump said during the campaign that he'd be different than the stereotypical Republicans, but he's not. You give the companies these massive tax breaks to stay, they leave, but they keep the tax breaks. It's just handing over these huge sums of money to companies. That's what we've seen under Republicans for literally decades.
Yeah,
and that's what we get under Trump.
He was hitting the jobs thing so effectively, but even at the time, and we mentioned here in the Turks, the greatest threat to American jobs is automation. Automation is by far a greater threat than any sort of problem with immigrants coming over the border, and that's just BS. I mean, in relation to the real threat to American jobs across the board, automation is a much greater threat.
Yeah, and by the way, look, I know to some extent, for those of you who are big progressives and didn't ever like Trump, this isn't gonna be a huge surprise to you. I get that. And you shouldn't just be mad at Trump. You can also be mad at these companies, by the way, because Trump didn't just lie, they lied to you as well, and will continue to do so. But this is more for those who are possibly like find Trump to be interesting or like seeing something different in the White House. You're not getting something different, you're getting lies. They just happen to have orange hair this time around. And I want you to be on the lookout, because the reason we focus on these 3 case studies is that there will be more. The next time he gets Lockheed Martin to supposedly make some sort of big investment that they already announced 3 years ago they were gonna make, people are gonna be ready to give him credit. But I want you to be armed with the knowledge to know that he lies about the process as it's ongoing, and as soon as the spotlight is off, very often those jobs don't actually materialize.
Membership helps fund the Young Turks. You know one great thing about that? That means we're not accountable to anyone but you guys. That's why we're strong together, because we built this show around you. Come build it even bigger and better at tytnetwork.com/join.